I've already introduced her, so I'm not going to do it again. We are absolutely thrilled now to hear from somebody who doesn't have a Southeast English accent. We're going to be hearing from Joanna Cherry.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to follow Tanya. And I think she's right that what happened to the EU citizens who were denied their basic democratic right to vote on the 23rd of May is very illustrative of something that's wrong with democracy in the United Kingdom at the moment. And I'd just like to make a little plug for my colleagues in the Scottish Government, because we do allow EU citizens to vote in Scottish elections and in the Scottish independence referendum. I was slightly concerned when I saw that the title that I was to be speaking to this evening was Safeguarding Our Constitution, because as someone who came into politics to try and achieve an independent Scotland, you'll not be surprised to hear that safeguarding the current British Constitution is not at the top of the list of my aims in life. That said, what I do share with others who've spoken this evening is that I passionately care about democracy and the rule of law. So it's really a pleasure to be here this evening and to share a platform with friends from other parties, with Lord Neuberger, and those who are non-aligned, but all of whom share a commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Because whereas Brexit has certainly shone a particularly strong light on the democratic deficits in the British Constitution, I think if Brexit has done one good thing, it has allowed us to see how much can be achieved when people work across party lines and traditional divides, as has happened in the House of Commons, and dyed-in-the-wool Scot Nats like myself with a history in the Labour Party find myself frequently giving Dominic Grieve a standing ovation when he gets to his feet, because people like Dominic have worked cross-party to try and address what has occurred to all the nations of these islands as a result of the Brexit vote. And I think Dominic's fight to get a meaningful vote, the fight to get indicative votes in the House of Commons, and also the case which established that Britain could unilaterally revoke Article 50, which I took with an SNP colleague, 2 Greens and 2 Scottish Labour Party MEPs, both of whom sadly lost their seats a couple of weeks ago. I think these efforts have established what can be achieved if we cross traditional lines. And with that in mind, I want to talk just briefly this evening about something positive that's happening in Scotland, which could provide a model for all of the nations of the UK as we try to avoid the sort of disaster that Brexit has brought upon us in the future. And that is that in Scotland, we now have a concrete plan to hold a series of citizens' assemblies in the autumn of this year. Now, Scotland's democratic deficit within the United Kingdom has been pretty well rehearsed. I spoke about it at the last convention. It has been highlighted by Brexit, but it existed before Brexit. After the Scottish independence referendum, I was one of 56 SNP MPs who were elected in the landslide of the 2015 general election, and we got 50% of the vote in Scotland. Because of the ridiculous first-past-the-post system, we got 56 out of the 59 MPs. But when the House of Commons came to debate the Scotland Act, which was supposedly to deliver more powers to the Scottish Parliament after the independence referendum, not one single amendment proposed by my party, the Scottish National Party, the party that had 50% of the vote in Scotland and 56 out of the 59 MPs, not one single one of the amendments we proposed to that bill was accepted. Now, that was prior to Brexit, but it's a real illustration of the democratic deficit that Scotland faces within the United Kingdom. And I know everyone in this room, and there's a lot of Remainers here, will know that Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU referendum. But despite that, all the Scottish Government's efforts to be part of the negotiations, or to propose a compromise or to suggest that Scotland might have a differentiated deal have really met with a brick wall. And it's against that background that support for the idea of a second Scottish independence referendum is growing. And I certainly know in my constituency of Edinburgh South West, which was very much a no to independence constituency in 2014, I now meet many constituents who say if it's a choice between an independent Scotland in the European Union and Scotland remaining part of a Britain that has Brexited, then people prefer independence in the EU. But I think people are burned by the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, and in Scotland there's a very real sense that we don't want to have a divisive second independence referendum, and we want to try and carry out some groundwork for bringing as many people with us as possible. And it's against that idea, which Dominic referred to earlier when he spoke about the Citizens' Assembly, which preceded the Irish abortion referendum. I very much pushed for this idea to become SNP party policy, and I was delighted when a motion I put to SNP conference earlier this year was passed by acclaim, and Nicola Sturgeon took on board the idea that as part of the process of preparing voters in Scotland for a second independence referendum, there will be a Citizens' Assembly held in Scotland this autumn. Now, I know there'll be many people in this room who have been very keen to perhaps resolve the Brexit problem by holding a Citizens' Assembly across the United Kingdom. And I would say that I am not against that idea, and should one happen, I would like to see Scots participate in it. But the debate has moved ahead in Scotland, and the Scottish Government announced that these citizens' assemblies will take place. And for me, one of the things that the citizens' assemblies will do is that they will make sure that the usual vested interest groups, people with the power and people with the money, and the mainstream media will not be the only people who set the agenda of the debate about Scotland's future. And I think we can see that when we can look to what was achieved in Ireland on the incredibly divisive issue, as it was in the Republic of Ireland, of abortion, where 99 random citizens selected by a process of sortition were brought together to debate the issues around abortion rights with the assistance of experts, but not dictated to by experts. The experts were described as being on tap rather than on top, and specific advocates of pro or anti-abortion were not part of the Citizens' Assembly. They could make written submissions, but it was ordinary, unaligned Irish citizens who made up the Assembly, and that's what we intend to do in Scotland. And when Nicola Sturgeon announced that it was her intention to hold a second independence referendum within the term of the current Scottish Parliament, and that's probably likely to be later next year, she said that prior to doing that, she would set up this Citizens' Assembly to bring together a representative cross-section of people living in Scotland with an independent chair to be tasked with considering, in broad terms, what kind of country are we seeking to build? How can we best overcome the challenges we face, including those arising from Brexit? And what further work needs to be carried out to give people the detail they need to make an informed choice about the future of Scotland? And I'm certainly very much advocating that EU citizens living in Scotland should be part of the selectorate for those citizens' assemblies. And last week it was announced to the Scottish Parliament by my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitutional Affairs in Scotland, that considerable progress has been made in setting up the Citizens' Assembly. The Cabinet Secretary responsible for it has been to Ireland and met with the people who were responsible for running the Constitutional Convention that preceded the equal marriage vote and the Citizens' Assembly which preceded the abortion vote, and arranging for a panel of experts from Ireland, the United Kingdom, and from overseas to inform the planning of the Scottish Government for the Citizens' Assembly. And the secretaries of the Irish Citizens' Assembly, the people who set it up, are being brought to Edinburgh later this month to brief members of the Scottish Parliament on how it worked in Ireland. And it's hoped that the announcements of who the independent chair will be and the formation of an expert steering group will be made over the summer, with a view to formulating the topics for deliberation and holding a first session in the autumn with 5 or 6 sessions completed by next spring. Now, I don't know what the topics for those citizens' assemblies are going to be. I know what the aims are. I have my own views. I'd really like to see the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland talk about Scotland's future relationship with Europe and how that interrelates with our choice of a currency. Rather a difficult and toxic subject for politicians, but perhaps something on which ordinary citizens could forge a way forward. I know people like Extinction Rebellion are very keen for a Citizens' Assembly on climate change, and although the Scottish Government has some world-leading legislation already on climate change, I think it being the crisis of our age, if you set Brexit to one side, then it probably would be a very good idea for the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland to look at that topic. So I just finish by saying that I'm very conscious that many people in this room will have been keen to have seen the sort of deliberative and participative democracy that a Citizens' Assembly embodies occur in England and across the whole of the United Kingdom. And I would say that, as I said at the last convention, I would always like to see Scotland and England continue in partnership. I'd like to see that as an equal partnership in the European Union, but I very much hope that as Scotland prepares to hold a second independence referendum, which I've no doubt this time will be won, the way in which we do that and the example of a Citizens' Assembly may serve as a little leaving gift, if you like, to the United Kingdom as a good example of what participative and deliberative democracy might look like. Thank you.